Welcome back. This is From Startup to Grown Up. My name is Alyssa Cohn, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Jake Schwartz to the podcast. Jake is the co-founder and former CEO of General Assembly, also known as GA, one of the very first tech education companies. He's currently the executive chairman at Brave Health, a mental health provider offering online therapy and medication management. Jake is a multi-time founder and entrepreneur, and he's a lot of great perspectives on the ups and downs of the entrepreneurial journey. We talked about the moment when he really got that he was meant to be an entrepreneur, and then what he calls the abandonment of fear due to desperation. We talked about how he met his co-founders and the role of serendipity, and how he now sees the GA team as a band finding their way with organic magic to it. Jake also talked about the early volatility of the team and their dynamics and how they dealt with them, in some ways productively and in some ways not so much. Jake shared his raw thoughts about how they learned as they went along, lots of mistakes they made, what happened when they almost ran out of money, and what Jake would have done differently looking back on it. This is a fun and raw and very practical conversation from the perspective of a seasoned entrepreneur looking back on his early days. You're going to love it, and I know you're going to profit from Jake's insights. So please enjoy this great conversation with Jake Schwartz, co-founder and former CEO of General Assembly. Jake, welcome to the show. I'm so happy you're here.
Thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
I'm super excited because you and I connected, the folks at Uniscore Ventures connected us, and we got into this like riff on just our initial conversation. And I was like, you must come to my podcast. You must. And so I want to ask you a bunch of questions about your experiences at GA and then also now currently what you're up to. But first, when we were doing the mic check, I said, where are you from? And you started answering me. I'm like, oh, that's too interesting. That's just, I'm saving for the podcast. So where did you grow up, Jake?
So I grew up in Oregon on a farm outside of Portland. Basically, the story was both my parents were kind of East Coast, Jewish refugees, went to the West Coast, drove around in a VW van. But they weren't really hippies because my dad was a doctor.
Oh.
But he was a cowboy doctor in that he didn't ever do a residency, right? Which you could actually get away with in the 70s when he was doing this. And so he went straight into working in the ER, like after his internship. And that's what he did. And he around the same time was also like, I think the 70s had a lot in common with the time where we live in now, where everybody is kind of vaguely convinced that the world's about to end.
Yes.
And so his version of that was he wanted to live on a farm and be self-sustaining. So we had a year's supply of grain in the barn. We had a gas tank on the property. We had chickens and sheep. And, he didn't really do that much with it because he was going off and doing like 48-hour shifts at the ER. But we had I grew up in this very sort of weird, more, I guess it sounds much more romantic than I remember it being because it's sort of just in the middle of nowhere, which for a kid, I don't know how good that is for a kid. But it was, I rode a tractor when I was 3, those kinds of things. And
wow.
I remember, dogs getting in with the chickens and things like that.
And having to deal with that. That's fascinating.
Stuff like that. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. What's old is new again, right? Like everyone now living off the land. I'm just curious, I did not know that about your background. Did that do you have any insights from that time that formed you as a human, as a professional, as an entrepreneur?
I don't know. I honestly don't know. I mean, other than, I would say that we moved from there to the suburbs when I was about 6 or 7, and I would say, my wife is a psychiatrist, and what she likes to say about that time is that I was not very well socialized as a young kid. And so I think I've spent my entire life feeling a little bit like on the outside and like treating the ideas and issues of how to interact with other people as a bit of a science experiment because I didn't ever learn how to do it in a more natural way. So, I would say that was that first feeling of being an outsider was truly living, outside. And I think I carried that, I was also a Jewish kid in Oregon, right? And, interested in ideas and stuff like that when everyone just wanted to play soccer. or football, and sort of, then ended up coming back east for college and sort of found my people. Like the first time I ever stepped foot in New York City, I was like, oh, this is where I was meant.
Right. Totally. There's a misplaced like Jewish New Yorker transplanted like against your will, right, to the West Coast. And then you came home and found your people. I can totally relate to all of that. And also the notion of being an outsider, which I wonder if that will show up in our themes as we go. But, I want to talk first about, what I think is your first big entrepreneurial venture, but correct me if I'm wrong, when you founded General Assembly. Can you tell us about General Assembly and the founding story and what that was all about?
Yeah, I would say it was not my first venture. It was my first venture that went anywhere interesting, right? And I would say that was sort of the first thing. Is even when when that started for me, my journey with it was that, and I actually think it's really relevant to the story of GI, is I had gone to business school. I'd started a performing arts space with some friends that happened. It was on 42nd Street in Manhattan. And it was supposed to be bulldozed, but then it never got bulldozed. And so we had like 2 years, and that became a nonprofit. And then that nonprofit is actually still around today. And then I started a roving art gallery to try to help young painters and photographers figure out how to take their work to market. They were sort of half like fun, gee whiz, let's do these projects, and half sort of learning, like, what does it mean to create something? What does it mean to do it as part of a team? What does it mean to do it yourself? And then I went to business school. And oh, by the way, while I was doing that, I was also working a day job, wearing a suit and tie and going to a very like upper crust white shoe, long only equity investment shop, right? So I was really living in this weird world of taking all these different pieces of information and cultures and trying to figure out where I fit in any of it. And then I went to business school and graduated from business school, and it was 2008. So and because I had done work in investment, I knew I remember I graduated in the spring of 2008. And things were bad if you read like macroeconomic news, but it wasn't like everybody was talking about it so overtly. I think Bear had gone under, but that seemed like, okay, maybe that was just it, and that was an anomaly. But I could sort of get the sense that something was bad happening. And so I was going to start a business. I was really intrigued by this concept of crowdfunding at the time. Like this was before Kickstarter. I just thought that was like, wow, all these different things you could do with that. But I decided instead to sort of take the safe route, which was to take a job offer I had gotten from a multi-stage private equity firm that was really like half family office, half private equity firm, and mostly as like a place to hide. But I spent about a year and a half there, and the day I started was the day Lehman fell. I remember. Now, being on the buy side, I was like, this is the best thing ever. We're just gonna we're in the middle of a crisis, like once in a century, like we can just buy everything. And that was sort of the naivete you come out of like a business school. In theory, that was correct. But in practicality, there's all sorts of questions of capital calls, existing investments, all that stuff that you don't quite understand when you're a newbie out of the whole thing. And so we ended up not doing very much at this firm in that year and a half that I spent there. And I was slowly sinking more and more toward the sense of like, I don't know, it was depression, anxiety, a sense that I had like taken the wrong job out of my one chance to get back in the rat race after business school.
Yeah.
And I just sort of had this moment of like, fuck it. Like I don't care if I'm going to be sleeping in a gutter. I'm not going to depend on anyone else to make my life what I want it to be. I'm not going to depend on anyone else for my career to be what I want it to be.
Yeah.
I'm going to be my own boss from now on.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, hang on. So that moment of clarity and truth for you, did that come from nowhere? Was it like a blinding, 3 a.m. moment? Was it sort of a weeks long process?
Look, for a long time, I had this sneaking suspicion that I was a terrible employee and that working for other people was just not what I was meant to do. I'm terribly ADHD. I'm very opinionated. I don't even like my wife laughs at me because I can't even like take an exercise class because I hate people telling me what to do in that context, right? So it's like it's that level of that.
Yeah.
So I was wrestling with this the whole time. I think that final bit was the bit of the fear that there was this other, easier, more what's the word I'm looking for? More like remunerative existence that was sort of represented by going to Wharton and like what my peers wanted, and that I was sort of like thinking I could have it all. And the moment that really changed everything for me was this moment, and I think it was probably preceded by a crisis or like a nervous breakdown where I didn't sleep for 2 days or something, where it was like, I just don't care anymore. Like, I just don't care about that other thing. This thing is more important to me, and I'm going to let that be my spiritual guide, which is to say I will not work for someone else. And everything else is up for grabs, but that is not. And that anchoring that, I would say, in weird ways, stuff started to happen, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I literally that next month met my now wife, right? Mm-hmm. And so there was almost like sort of like an abandoning of fear out of desperation, right? This sort of like, I think of it almost as like hitting my bottom. But the other thing I started doing was just hustling to try to get people to pay me little bits of money to do work, right? Because my first business that I started, because I now am my own boss, was to try to go get clients to be a consultant, right? And I sort of done little bits of that before, but it was just literally going around anyone I could talk to, big companies, small companies, startup. Hey, let me pitch you on how I can help. And got into some weird, interesting projects, right? Some of my early clients are now some of my best friends, right? Just because it was just a weird moment. But I always left one day of a week, even when I got myself pretty booked up, right? And I was paying my rent by doing this, which was an early success, I would say. And then I always left a day of the week for the projects where I owned equity, right? That wasn't about paying my rent. One of those projects was working with some commercial real estate brokers I had met on a lead gen site, using like a PPC kind of lead gen strategy for that.
Wait. PPC lead gen, what's that?
Pay-per-click, like just like classic, like Google, somebody Google something, like turn them into leads for this commercial real estate broker. Under the theory, because commercial real estate brokers, I don't know if people know this, like make a lot of money, right? Because each of these tenants, if they sign a lease, it's worth tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars. Yeah. So the theory was there, and I thought this was going to be the thing that was going to make me rich. And I had this other little project that was sort of related to my real estate thing, which was I met really this kid who had just graduated from my undergrad alma mater, Yale, and he was like had already started a company and raised venture money. His name was Matt Breimer. And he was talking about this idea, this vision of getting a space for his friends to start companies. He was calling it superconductor. And I was like, well, let's chat. Like, you seem neat, right? You're neat and interesting. And I know a few things because I went to Wharton. And why don't you come over and have some beer? Maybe I'll help you like model out what this might look like. And I'll introduce you to some people in commercial real estate, things like that. That sort of started this cascade, this snowball of what was just at the time another project in the portfolio called Superconductor. And he brought in one of his co-founders from his previous startup, Brad. And then we met another kid who was, recently graduated from Columbia, who was talking about doing this more with the design till was sort of his passion at the time. And that was Adam Pritzker. And we all, because this was sort of a formless project, it was sort of all like, hey, well, let's do this together. And then, we ended up forming this partnership, renting a space that was too big for us and sort of going for it, right? And everybody brought things to that equation in interesting ways. And for a very long time, it wasn't clear what it was. And then once it started to take form, it started to get this momentum. And as that momentum happened, everything else that I was doing sort of fell away because I was like, this is way more interesting and seems like it's just got this energy behind it. And I want to put all my time into that. But, that was sort of this weird journey, and it happened slowly and then quickly. And then all at once, all of a sudden, I was the CEO of this thing. Mostly just because I was like slightly older than everybody and had a little bit more, had a little bit more, like I would say, like emotional maturity and emotional intelligence about it by the nature of my, agedness.
Your seniority.
Right.
Your seniority. And maybe you...
we're talking about like, maybe I was like, 5 years old. It just seems so much at the time.
Yeah.
And so it was like, I could kind of hold the pieces together. And I mean, we'll probably get into this, but I mean, you should never start a business like this, really. Like no textbook would say, just form a partnership. We had I'll talk about how we did this. We all split the equity evenly with 2 parts for Adam because he was bringing some money to the table. And so that was sort of like the way we did it. The voting was very, it was all very amorphous. We didn't really have clear roles and responsibilities. And we didn't even have a vision for what this business was going to be other than what was right in front of our face, right? So I'm sure we all had different pictures in our heads. And the sort of analogy that I've sort of taken with it is that really what we did was form a band. And we started doing gigs, but before we knew it, we had like a record contract, right? And that was when we took our first VC money. All of those dynamics that you see play out again and again, even in like the best bands in the world, basically played out with us.
Yeah.
And, that to me is like that. When I think about like the Beatles story, you go like that. I don't know if you saw that documentary, Get Back, on Disney. Yeah. It's like 9 hours. I was wrapped. Yeah. The reason I was wrapped is because I was seeing these dynamics play out with like literally some of the most famous people in the world that reminded me of my most like intense formative experience. Like it was not there because I think it had this magic to it. And to this day, I couldn't quite tell you why it worked. The timing was right? We all had different things to it. We invested in certain ways. We focused on it. But like, I think at the end of the day, it's like everybody got there, was passionate about it, brought 110% for that, not fully knowing what we were going to get out of it. But I think we all in our delusions all thought we were going to get 110% out of it, right? And that's sort of what then engenders weird issues later on. Yeah,
well, and of course, I want to get into those weird issues. Sorry, were you going to say something else?
I was going to say, and I the other thing is that, so at some point because Adam was very passionate about design, we invested a lot in brand. And that involved, he brought along, so one of his sort of people that he brought to the table was Mini Chun, who was this incredibly talented designer. She had done this really cool project that I remember seeing before I met her, which was that she had like cataloged the colors of her food and then made like infographics out of them.
Wait, say that again? She did what?
She had cataloged the colors of her food. And then made like infographics out of them. I mean, she was an artist, really deep thinking, really, really experienced, that she'd worked for a long time at IDEO. And so this was like a big get for us. And so she invested her time in building like the brand, some of the brand assets that they still use today. But one of the key conditions to helping us was that we had to change the name because she thought superconductor was too not cool enough, I guess, basically. It was really funny. And it was like, and so we went through this whole design process with her and, had a bazillion names and directions and ideas and sort of formulated down and through a lot of collaborative, wrestling that landed on General Assembly. But we were still just a co-working space. Right? But we had happened to have this idea that the metaphor of it was a college campus, right? It was sort of a college campus in the city. That idea of the common room, And everybody, that we were also young and out of college, like we missed that, right? That was what we sort of fantasized about, and found that the world of work didn't really provide that at all. And so what couldn't we provide that for all these entrepreneurs? And so we had this room that we called the classroom. And that decision turned into and by the way, I think we called it that because we didn't know what else to call it because it didn't have any windows. And so otherwise it was just going to be this like weird dungeon. And so by calling it classroom, we sort of got out of like this problem of what do we call this room?
Right.
And that decision led to then a whole sequence of other stuff that happened that led to a complete pivot, right, from when the original idea was to this idea of maybe the revenue engine that's going to make this organization grow is education.
Yep. Wow. I have so many questions, so many things to follow up on this.
I don't know if that was like a coherent founding story, but it and I think I'm trying to be, I think part of the reason I like telling it like that is because it does have a sort of organic magic to it that I think is really special. And I think the farther I get away from it, that's how I think about it more and more. Is like, I'm not 100% sure why it became what it became in all those different steps. And it was out of this stew of stuff and this desire to create, desire to be part of something, desire to create a community that all these things happened. Now, of course, along the way, there were lots of steps of, okay, how are we going to pay the lease that we just signed? How are we going to pay the monthly rent on that? What are we going to do? That went to, okay, well, we could keep selling more real estate, but that would involve taking more leases. That seems like a recipe for what happened in 2008.
Yeah.
So that is the answer to why we didn't become WeWork, right? And by the way, WeWork visited our space, took the inspiration and took it to help inform their model. And they went on to do that, right? So, which I felt very stupid about for the longest of times.
Right, and now who's laughing now? In the fullness of time.
Adam Newman is still laughing.
I
think he took home about $3 billion.
Yeah, he did not do, but don't cry for me, Argentina, Adam Newman. I agree. But hang on, I want to back up. So I love sort of the story here and also how organic it was. I also love how you were the CEO because you were more emotionally intelligent. Obviously, all that work with the chickens and the dogs from your early childhood. But as you said, textbooks would not tell you to do this. And in fact, my own book, From Startup to Grown Up, would tell you don't do that. And so I'm curious, what are, it sounds like you didn't have hardly any conversations about roles and responsibilities and kind of vision for the future. You just went with it. And there is a magic to just kind of going with it. But did you have any conversations early on to kind of get rooted in your partnership?
Definitely not in the partnership, right? I mean, look, yes, I'm sure we talked about it, but it was all in like, okay, where are we going to sit and what are our roles around running this real estate rental business, right? I mean, that was the level of it. And in terms of vision for the future, we had all these grand ideas or possibilities, but it was all very abstract, right? Because none of us had really ever done that journey. But well, that's not true, because I had started these things and Matt and Brad had started their things. And so we had like a sense of it, but that 0 to 1 phase is so sort of raw and it's so primordial in what can happen, and every decision can have these impacts. And I think the way I did it was I brought my Wharton sort of spreadsheet to it, and I was like, well, let's stay grounded in now, because the one thing I do know is that if this idea that we're working on right now doesn't work, we're going to have a really hard time doing anything else. One idea was that we were all just going to take space in this co-working space we were building, and then start our own the real ventures. Right. So that was the level of the amorphousness of it. Now, I bet you if you asked the three people and the other early people that were there, they might have all said, "Oh, I thought this was going to happen," or "We definitely talked about that." But I think this idea of pictures in your head, that everybody's coming with a different picture, is something that I think is. I learned a lot from. And as I talk to entrepreneurs now, I think understanding the pictures they have in their heads and the ones, especially ones they're not saying, are sometimes the most important. I was going to say the other piece of it is this is something I struggle with a lot, is that, yes, you would not have told anyone to do it like this, right? And yet, in many ways, I mean, I would say we had a much more successful outcome, 11 years in the future than a lot of people who did it the right
traditional way,
right?
Yeah.
Or the textbook way, or even the way that, people on blogs would say that you should do it. And I wrestle with that because it sort of says that, like, okay, there is a best way to have it happen. But I think there's this thing that nobody says is you also have to have a little magic, right? You got to find that magic from somewhere. And now, I will say that magic almost got crushed by our lack of structure and that work on that partnership early on.
Yeah.
And it made the first 2.5 years incredibly volatile.
Yeah.
But I can look back now and say, yeah, obviously there would be ways to avoid that. But I'm not sure if we had done that, we would have gone down the path that led to what it was.
Yeah.
And I don't have to live in that paradox of like,
Yeah.
I don't know how to talk about that.
Yeah, I totally get that. And I think that's really just honest. Like, on the one hand, we made every mistake in the book, and on the other hand, we were like enormously successful. However, there were those volatile times. And I'd love you to paint the picture of some of those early days and the volatility in those early days.
Oh man. I mean, the volatility was everything of like, who's going to clean the toilet on day one? Like, literally, it was like that kind of stuff.
Who ended up cleaning the toilet?
Not Brimer cleaned the toilet, but I can't remember how we made him do it. But I still feel bad about it. But I don't think about it. Maybe he was the youngest. That was probably like netted out to be that he was the youngest. But I think he ostensibly was sort of in charge of the community. He had really did all the early work to build the community of people that rented space from us. And I mean, he must have given like 100 tours of the space before it was built, telling stories about what it could be. And that really is his genius, right?
Yeah.
Is that. And so that was sort of, I think that was sort of his job, because he had made it his job, right? And
right.
so, and then, it's so funny now to look back on it, because I would say, like, all of these little things that happened, from that to our first employee, to firing our first employee, right? We hired someone to work the front desk, and then we had to fire that person like 2 months later, realizing they wanted the right person, because we had to remember, okay, fire fast, right? Fire fast. Okay.
Right.
We didn't know. I don't think I'd ever fired anybody before, right? I don't think anybody of us had. So I remember calling somebody, getting advice from somebody. I think one of Adam's people advisors sort of said, I'll give him advice on how to fire. And I heard all these things of what not to do, and I'm like a nervous wreck going in there and doing it. And
how did you do it?
I mean, you're asking me about what I did 12 years ago, and I'm sure I just sat down and said, okay, this isn't working out. And I'm sure I got some like overly wrought advice, like make sure she doesn't have email access already. These like crazy corporate things that were not relevant, and then tried to pretend like I was really a grown up doing that. But, I think there's a lot. I think back on this time now, I'm now in my 40s. We were all just kids, right? I mean, I was the oldest at 30. And I mean, I think in some contexts I would have been considered an adult, right? But in terms of it was all pretending.
Yeah.
Playing dress up as like business people, right?
Yeah.
And it was super fun and funny, and tons of amazing experiences came out of that and stories. But it's hard to take any of that seriously now, other than to say, wow, we really didn't know what we were doing. And every problem that we had, we created, right?
Yeah.
And I almost have I have a sort of empathy and soft spot for that crew, right? That was just doing everything so passionately and we're so focused in using everything that we could find to try to make this successful that it actually worked.
Yeah.
But I do sometimes think that it was like in spite of our efforts that it worked, right? Because God knows how many ways we got in our own way.
Well, I'd love to hear that. I mean, you refer to that. Like, what are some examples? Like, what was a point where you could now look back on and say, oh, that crew was getting in their own way.
A great example is when we started offering classes and they were working, right? But everything was so raw. Like everything was okay, is this aligned with what our spirit is? And how are we going to do it? And I mean, I remember our first long form course. This was like the big, we went from selling tickets for a one night class, which I sort of always described as like being like a shitty off Broadway theater. Because they're changing the play every night was sort of the business model. It was horrible.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay, if we need to be able to like at least get people in here for multiple weeks at a time, and then all of a sudden it could be an interesting business. And so we did that, but we were so scared of like that we would damage our reputations. And maybe this was the right decision. I don't know, but that we kind of like thought about everything, and then to our credit, we didn't do it. But then, of course, it was a disaster. And like, I think half the people, we were so lucky they didn't just demand our money back, right? Their money back. Because I think at some level, they all knew we were a startup too.
Yeah.
And our hearts were in the right place. But I remember one day, this is the way that this is the way we built it, right? So one day we had these teachers. It was everybody we could find. We didn't like ask, is this person going to be a good teacher in front of the class? Or are they going to... So one day I was like, so how did class go last night? Well, it ended after the first 30 minutes because they couldn't get the projector to work. What? So I was like, okay, maybe we should have someone from our team who sits in the class to make sure that things like the projector work. And that created this role called the producer role. And then that became part of the operating model, right? And literally, we just did that over and over and over again. There was no intention. There was no like, okay, let's think about this ahead of time and model this out. It was like, let's figure out everything in real time and see what we can get away with. And,
right.
I mean, that's kind of how we did it. I mean, the real breaking point was, at the end of the day was, I would say like one of my biggest mistakes that I think about all the time is among the four of us, was that I was trying to keep a bunch of young males' egos to somehow go in the same direction. And I think what I tried to do was sort of yes everybody and sort of placate everybody and try to keep it sort of all hunky-dory. But meanwhile, like these ideas in people's heads were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Adam comes from an incredibly successful business sort of dynasty in a way. But he was carrying his own baggage with him around that of what he was going to be and how he was going to do it. And he had tons this weight and expectations, but he would sort of take that out on this and what he thought his role should be. And I don't think I was willing to necessarily confront that, right? And say, well, we're going to have to figure this out. Meanwhile, Adam and Matt and Brad were both like younger but more experienced, but in some ways more naive, right? And they sort of had, and they had this other image of we were this happy band of pirates going and doing this, and it would get, their feathers would get ruffled when all of a sudden there was this vibe of, wait, why is this guy telling me what to do? Or why is there pressure? It was a very, we were just feeling it all out. And I think instead of saying, wow, this is a real problem, I think I kind of just tried to keep it at peace, right?
Yeah.
And the reality with those kinds of problems and that is they don't get better if you don't talk about them.
Right.
And we were fortunate. I mean, it really came to a head when we got an offer for venture capital investment. That was where the pictures in the heads got wildly divergent, right? I don't know, should we, shouldn't we? Everybody was sort of on the fence. We all sort of came on a spectrum of whether we should or we shouldn't.
Take the money, take the
money, right? Yeah. And because we were ostensibly cash flow positive, right? And because we were renting space, it was not hard to do that. And that was sort of the moment where it seemed like the whole thing could just already split apart. At the moment where we were being offered millions of dollars, right?
Yeah.
But that was, and I would say that was where probably some of the most lasting scars came from of the whole thing, was that moment and how it sort of got pushed through.
So paint that picture for us. What happened and how did the scars get created?
I think if I remember, this is so long ago. It's almost like not fair, like, because I'm like representing how other people were thinking and stuff. Like, literally, we were children. We were all children. But I think it came down to, if we take this money, we're like basically signing up for the rat race, and we won't be in control anymore. And I think the other side of it was, but then we could be potentially really big. But that divide. We made one decision. I couldn't tell you if it was the right or wrong decision today, even today. I can tell you, with how the outcome happened, literally a decade later, it was the right decision.
Yeah.
But I can tell you there was plenty of points along that way where I was like, man, I wish we just hadn't taken that money.
Yeah. What were some moments where you would have said to yourself, I wish we hadn't taken that money? And by the way, what you're saying is you're looking back on yourself 12 years ago. I hear you. But guess what? The listeners of this show are in your shoes 12 years ago. Yeah. And so you're speaking to them.
I'm happy to give advice from them, but I think giving it the holistic perspective is actually better, right? So there were plenty of moments where the survival of GA as forget about going concern, as a vehicle for any kind of idea of personal success was completely like at risk, and looked like it was already over. And I mean, that was basically every time we raised money from then on, right? Because every time it's an existential moment, and it involves legal structure and voting, and then can we get people to invest, and who are we bringing onto the board? And every one of those rounds, I would say, was momentous and hard.
Yeah, and stressful.
And incredibly stressful.
And brought up dynamics among your co-founders.
Especially the B. The B was, I actually think that, now that I'm remembering it, I think the B was the moment where it seemed like we might not make it. I think it was a lot my fault, because I think we had hired some. Here's a piece of like practical advice. No matter if you're venture backed or not, you cannot. You will hire someone to do your finances because you don't want to do them. I can almost guarantee, unless you're like one out of 50 companies, that person will fuck you so completely and not tell you that you are running out of money when you are. Because that first person you hire is taking this job that they shouldn't take because they don't know the questions to ask.
Yeah. And
this will all end you running out of money at a very inconvenient moment and having to solve it from there.
Oh my God.
I see this all, look, I'm exaggerating a little, but not by that much.
Yeah. So what happened to you guys in your B? What do you mean?
We ran out of money. I remember.
You actually ran out of money.
We were like so close to running out of money. Yeah. Me and Adam at that time were like, it was a complete war between the two of us. And it was literally like, who's going to be, he really, because he had put that initial investment in, which was like, I think it was like $200,000 or something. He wanted to be chairman and be at the top left of every. It was a fight about who was going to be on the top left of a fundraising class. Meanwhile, we're running out of money, and this is sort of the insanity of the moment. I can reflect. And by the way, Adam and I are now like very close again. But we can laugh about this now, but at the time it was life or death. It was, we could have come to blows. We could have come to lawsuits. And I think it's to the nature of everyone around us that we somehow didn't do that. But it was an intense time. And, but I would say after the B, and we got a new finance person in after the B, and I had sort of clung to the CEO title and the job by like the skin of my, what do they say about
hair of the chinny chin chin?
Hair of the chinny chin chin. That was like literally like by my claws had hung on barely, like almost it was the end. And that year, I think this must have been like, it was probably 2013. Mm-hmm. We beat our plan by like 50%,
Mm-hmm.
grew by, I think, 3 or 4x.
Yeah.
And things started to get better.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So I sort of think of it, you can sort of think that was the sort of founding years, right? When every good idea happened in many ways. Like all the early, that early magic stuff happened. But every bad idea also happened, right? Every problem later. And some of them were these like structural things that had started to work out and would continue to work out over time. But also on the business side, right? So every product idea, we got really attached because our first, classes were in person and worked and people paid us for them. We got so attached to that idea. But even as we raised more money and we're intending to scale around the world, we didn't bother asking ourselves, is this really a scalable model for the future that's going to take us to a profitable, promised land?
Yeah.
And part of it was, that early stage VC game is all about your revenue top line growing, especially then. We sort of saw that almost redux and exaggerated in 2020 and 2021.
Yeah.
But this was sort of that early first phase of it. It was like, if your revenue is growing, this was when Fab raised like $100 million, right?
Yes.
Right. And it was all on the basis of just the revenue going like this. It didn't matter that, Uber, same thing. Their revenue was growing like in a very, very steep line up and to the right. And, it is striking that even today, Uber can't really turn a profit, right?
Yeah.
That was what was created then. And we were, I think, children of that moment too. And so I think about it a lot now because, the problem of, okay, is this model profitable? The problem of how is this going to truly scale was my problem later, right? And specifically mine is sort of the last remaining founding member who was the CEO who is stuck with this thing and has to figure out how to make something or get it to a finishing point or of some sort. And all of those decisions that we basically put off because as long as it makes revenue go up, let's do it. Revenue go up, let's do it. Revenue, let's go. Okay. That works really well in those early times. And it's frankly what the VCs want, I think. But if I could go back, I think I told you this the first time we talked, and which is, I think, probably what got you to want me to, do the longer form version of it. So I'll put this in light, is if I wish at that moment, I certainly did not have, I just told you this whole story of like what a train wreck I was as an early CEO and didn't know what I was doing. I did not have either the gravitas or even the thoughtfulness to say, we need to pause and figure out what's going to make this work long term. But I think if I had in the boardroom, I think my VC would have fired me on this. Because that was not, the idea was, we have product market fit. Let's go.
Right.
I understand that point of view, and I think there is a time and a place for that. And I would say, maybe it all worked out, right? But if you can it is nice to at least think for the long term, and as I construct these other ventures and work with startups, I often say this all the time is, it's not necessarily bad if your model isn't scalable today. It doesn't mean you don't have product market fit. It means you have to make adjustments to that. And it is way easier to make adjustments to that when your revenue is $1 million a year versus when it's $100 million a year.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
$1 million a year is frankly like a little bit of like turning up and down knobs on the equalizer.
And you can experiment.
$100 million a year, that is a full board pivot in midair and will probably lead to major issues.
Yeah.
At precisely the time when you can least afford it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think, I think a cap on that, because I was talking about the real challenge of this business was that it was built in real world. It was one of the magic of the business.
Yeah.
And I think we could have kept version of that forever. But, even, 5-6 years on, I'm telling these stories to VCs, we're going to be more online. You're trying these online products. Well, in March of 2020, right? We're now a subsidiary of Adecco.
When did you get acquired?
2018.
Okay. Yeah.
We were
and you're still the CEO.
Still the CEO. I mean, my funnel kind of like structure as being CEO. And the lockdowns happened.
Mm-hmm.
And it took us less than a week to turn the entire business completely virtual.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. And frankly, the NPS of our core products went up during that period of time.
Mm-hmm.
We spent years and years and years being afraid of that, being cute about it, trying to innovate at the margins, not wanting to mess with the thing. Right.
Yeah.
And it turned out that just doing it and being brave about it would have worked just fine. Now, it's a lot of revisionist history, sure. I mean, it was 5 or 6 years on, the product was more evolved, the team was more evolved, we maybe had those muscles. But imagine if we had just built from day one and been patient about the revenue growth.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We could have been in that place with half the capital raised, right? And I think this is what being an old bond teaches you. Is like, there are these early things that when you're planting those seeds, like if you're thoughtful about it, it will work. But I can say that not being so nervous that any one single move is going to lead to me being a failure. Right?
Yeah, so
personally and professionally.
Yeah, talk about that because that's important. That's in everybody's way, and that was obviously in your way then. So you have this inner experience of, I better not screw this up. And everyone's saying we can't do this. Like, what was it like to have the inner experience of afraid of being a failure and just being afraid?
I mean, I think so. We were one part of the sort of founding story and that messiness that I didn't talk about is we were lucky enough to find Jerry Colonna and get to work with him, and which helped make things better. They didn't get them all the way better, but it got us at least going in the right direction.
Yeah, Jerry Colonna, another very well-known coach, and also featured in my book, From Startup to Grown Up. Yeah, and a very good human
book, which is great, and his podcasts are great, and he tells his journey. Yeah, and I would say one of the things that he does so well is really he gave permission to have your feelings about this and to have emotions and to have good days and bad days and fears and voice those fears. And so that didn't make you a worse business person because you did that. Mm-hmm. For me, that was a godsend because I that being allowed to release that and to not feel like I needed to be somebody else was sort of the beginning of my journey to being sort of the leader that I had the potential to be. Yeah. That I was only just scratching the surface on. And so where were we going with this? So fear. So that was sort of began that feeling of, I can talk about this, I can feel that. Now, I think that being able to voice that fear, that helped a little bit, and we could all share our fears together.
So that's what you did. You had group discussions, and
we could talk about what are we afraid of, personally, right? But what now I think I could say is like, and Jerry had this line, is where I was going with this, was that that early startup experience brings out everybody's narcissism, right? Mm-hmm. Everybody's. Mm-hmm. And it's funny because with Donald Trump now, everybody thinks they understand what narcissism is, right? Right. And he has a very specific, malignant, extreme form of that is what they would diagnose, malignant narcissist, which sort of means there's no coming back from it. But the secret is that we all have these wounds on the inside and these injuries and these places that we feel really weak or bruised or vulnerable. And when those things get poked, these old defenses can come out, right? And they're typically, it can be a lot of different things. It can be anger, it can be aggression, it can be histrionics, it can be, dissociation, it can be. And there's nothing like a startup where every day is a roller coaster of I'm a success, I'm a failure, I'm a success, I'm a failure, to really bring out your most primal defenses. And the problem with those defenses is they're not they're not based in reality, and you aren't reacting to what's really around you. You're reacting to what's inside your head. And the challenge of a startup is trying to separate what's real from not in a place where nothing's real. And so that, that's when things get ugly, because that's when things get solid. That's when those big fights happen. That's when really strange erratic behavior starts to come out, and your team starts to wonder what's going on.
Yeah.
All of those things are all coming from that place of like, if you could just sit down and say, wow, I am triggered right now. I am afraid.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm taking that out on the people around me.
Yeah. And acting out, right? I think what you're saying is so important. Like one gets triggered, and to your point, the stress and the ups and downs, they trigger everybody. They trigger everybody in a startup. It's such an extreme work environment. And the second thing is, you don't even know why you're being triggered necessarily. Like you said earlier, that you don't want anyone to tell you what to do. And if you're not aware of that and conscious of that, then it just triggers you, right? And then you don't even know you're being triggered. So the normal thing to do is react, yell at someone, sulk, whatever it is your normal behavior. And then all four of you are doing that. It sounds pretty chaotic.
Well, by that point, by the way, there's more than just the four of us, right?
Yeah.
There's some, and I actually want to say this. This is actually really important to me. There's so much focus on founding stories.
Yeah.
There's a lot of myth making, and what I tried to do in our little founding section was like sort of, almost sort of a mumblecore kind of way, like this deconstruct thought, because I think it's a lot of myth making, and you build it up and you build it up in your own head, and everybody's got this story because it becomes this important, it's a founding part of my life story now.
Yeah, yeah.
But it's a multitudinal thing. But those early people, those early employees are so crucial, and I can think of the people who are part of our, let's call it the first year, and not everybody that first year that we hired, but some of those people, did things for the business that were formative and long lasting, and, were almost played savior roles time and time again throughout the course of it.
Mm-hmm.
And, and they did it without the same level of ego promise to themselves to do it. And I think I often think about that a lot. I mean, especially because my co-founder now is Anna, who was really one of those people in early GI.
Yeah.
But I think frankly, one of the best things I did as that early CEO was allow that early group of people who were all incredibly smart and talented to kind of just get the same level of autonomy and authority that I wanted for myself, and say, go for it. Yeah. And let the ones that really saw that as their calling, like, embrace it and run with it. Yeah. And so I think I want to recognize those people, because I think in some ways those are the people, those first hires are who makes the culture, I think, in the really, really long term, because those are the people, the ones that are the success cases out of that are the ones that end up hiring everyone and keeping that flame, that idea of what the business really is, and the culture of that alive.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is so powerful that you're just saying that and giving voice to that. Those early people being part of the founding story.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And
it's hard, right? Because the world wants these founder stories. They eat it up, right? The media wants it. It helps kind of keep it in a nice little box and a nice little bow. And my experience is that it is very rarely as simple as, like, so many founding stories are so much more complicated, right, than the public version that gets told.
Totally.
And oftentimes there will be some sort of war or battle around what founding story gets told.
True too.
As an example that is sort of well known, it's public, but I don't know how commonly known is that Elon Musk didn't found Tesla, right? Did you?
I didn't know that.
You didn't even know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Tell me about that.
Early backer, and ended up just sort of taking over the whole thing.
Really? I did not know that.
Jack Dorsey founded Square.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Or Twitter. Yeah, that's a whole other.
Everybody knows that story because it was so. That's like the poster child, right?
Totally.
And it's funny when I think about that story now, and you can do it with the fullness of time, you have empathy for every player in that story, right?
Yeah.
You understand where they were coming from. And I think in some ways you could think of Twitter as like the big boy version of what happened to us, is that sometimes it's like the success. It's like when startups, when there's nothing at stake, startups can kind of meander and do all this weird nut stuff and be cool, non-traditional things.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden there's something of value there.
Right.
And not value, it becomes like the ring, right? In the Lord of the Ring, right? All of a sudden, because there's value there, everything changes. The dynamics change so quickly. And oftentimes it exposes the sort of places of instability.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, there's so much there. I guess, I appreciate that you're looking back, and I really appreciate how much you have this sort of perspective from the fullness of time. So if you were going back to yourself and just to talk about your co-founder relationship, what advice would you give yourself and your co-founders just on that relationship part?
It's so tricky. Let's assume that the bandwidth is very, very slow, right? So you can't write paragraphs. I'd probably write a novel, right? Here's what's going to happen. Don't do this, don't do that. And here's what you should do. Frankly, don't do any of this. Just buy Bitcoin, right? No, I'm joking. But
this is not investment advice.
Yeah, non-investment advice. But I probably would say, let's say I would only say one sentence. I would say, nothing that is bad now is going to get better by accident or get better on its own.
That's very wise.
It is most likely going to get significantly worse when there is more at stake.
So therefore,
you need to address it.
And how do you address it?
I could probably have hard conversations where you're vulnerable.
Yeah.
And where you are prepared to hear things that you don't want to hear.
Very powerful.
Truths that you don't want to acknowledge are true.
Yeah. And I see that really lands for you. I guess I'm curious, if this might be another novel for you to write, but can you picture in that journey for yourself some of the ways that you grew as a CEO?
I'm going to divide it into a couple categories.
Yeah.
Because there's one that we haven't spent any time on it, and I think it was sort of intentional, and I like it, which is the skills part of it, right? Mm-hmm. Which is that running a business is not an art, or not solely an art. Mm-hmm. It is a science, and there is a lot of practitioners of that. And there are a lot of useful tools and frameworks and things that you can learn that make you better at it.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
This is the way that it's not like a band.
Mm-hmm.
Right? But it's interesting that, like, say, a weathered 60-year-old session guitar player is never going to go and write Let It Be. Right? And there's something to that. But I would say that is also not to say that, George Harrison couldn't have learned a ton from those elders. Mm. And so there's a ton of skills, I guess, is what I'm going to say. And it goes on a financial, it's like things like unit economics. And maybe you could summarize it all under the first truth is that you are running a business. Mm-hmm. And you can't escape that. You can't run away from that. That is the truth of it. The second part of that is people have done what you are doing before. And you can learn from them.
Yeah.
But that involves being willing to admit that you don't know everything and that you don't actually know how to do that.
Yeah.
It involves being vulnerable, which then goes back to our initial thing, which is that you have to find a way to be okay, not being the smartest person in the room, not being vulnerable, being able to sit with those feelings and still move forward.
Yeah.
It's a lot easier said than done.
Totally.
Okay. So the skill side of it, you develop a ton.
Yeah.
Right? And frankly, some of it is stage appropriate, right? So I'm not sure, one of the things, I'm now the co-founder and the exec chairman of Brave Health, and it's a healthcare business. And we're, on our Series C and sort of, we've gone through bits of that journey, but it's a different journey. And I would say in those early stages, I really had to unlearn a lot of stuff that I had learned, because when you're doing over $100 million of revenue a year and you have a global team and you can afford to hire any executive you need to do any function you need and pay any lawyers, right? It's like all of these things take on a very different shape. It's a very different set of challenges when it's early. And I find those challenges more interesting personally, but they're both. But they do go on a spectrum and they do go on a journey. And the things you don't do today become the things you wish you had done tomorrow. So that's what I would say. So the skills, I think I learned a ton and it made me a better, but a lot of that then I would say circles back and it comes to a certain type of confidence tempered by experience, right? Which is the inner work is understanding that it's okay to be myself, right? But I can be a leader, but I have to lead from my own place and lead and be comfortable with that, right? And not lose that sort of essence of that. While at the same time, there's the external side of it, and that's what their temperament comes in. There is a whole skill of engaging with other human beings in different contexts, in different roles, in different power dynamics, in different moments. And being able to both understand myself and bring myself fully to that situation and react honestly to it and with my own instincts, but then also know how to speak to that person and converse with that person, both so I can be heard. And I think maybe even the more important thing is so that I can hear what that other person says. And I think what I would say is all of that goes under the heading of being comfortable enough in your own skin to be present in the conversations you're having and in the business that you're actually running and the problems that you're actually trying to deal with. That's sort of the overarching point of it. But there's a lot of little bits along the way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Is there one bit that you could just say sort of tangibly, one little bit?
Yes. Probably the best thing I got better at as a CEO was to learn to trust my instinct that when something was wrong, it was actually wrong. But that little spidey sense that no one else could have. And the other thing is to understand that as the founder and as the CEO, I have a vantage point and I have permission to be a little neurotic with my early warning sensors about what's going to be wrong and how it might be best fixed. And that's okay. You have a certain latitude, and learning where those latitudes are and aren't, it was part, I think, of the journey.
Yeah.
But you have to be able to trust your instincts.
Yeah.
That's not to say that you're allowed to be a jerk to everybody because you're right, or that because every whim that you have must be followed by your entire team. And I probably erred a little bit on like, wow, I have all these people around there. They're all experienced. Like, what can I even offer at this point? And a lot of it was me finding my own confidence in my own seat and being like, it was okay that I'm the CEO. I'm allowed to be here. I'm allowed to have opinions. And in fact, in this seat, my opinion matters more than everyone else's.
Yeah.
And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I find with most young CEOs, at least the ones I choose to work with, which tend to be maybe a little more thoughtful and conscientious because of who I am, but I tend to have to give that message over and over and over again. Right?
Yeah.
You're allowed to do that. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. That's super powerful. I moderated a panel at Collision, the tech conference, and there was was so-called the unicorn panel. And both of these so-called unicorns said that there is a sense that you have as the founder CEO and that it just it causes you to zoom in all of a sudden, and people around you may not like it and may not understand where it's coming from, but you know. And when you zoom in, it just turns out to be a thing. And you're saying that as well as the confidence to recognize that even though people, and I just talked to a founder yesterday, literally, who said, I'm now managing people who are 20 years older than I am. And yet you, the CEO and the founder, have so much to add to that table.
And this is something, I see this all the time, because Anna, who was really, so crucial to GA for years and years and years, and became, we became partners, and she's the CEO of this. And, this is it's a new role for both of us, right? She's used to me being the CEO, and me telling me what to do. And it was a whole exercise for us. And I wouldn't say we were even perfect at it, figuring out how to do this new role where I'm not going to tell you what to do.
Right.
But a lot of my role has been to say, you're allowed to do this. You're allowed to have an opinion on this. You're allowed to piss this person off.
Yeah.
You're allowed to have this weird idiosyncratic quirk that no one else is going to understand because you're the CEO.
Right. Well, let's actually switch gears and talk about Brave Health. So you co-founded this with Anna, one of your former employees from GA. She's the CEO.
Yes.
You're the executive chairman. And I guess I am so curious, in addition to sort of obviously mentor, well, that's so fascinating. Like she looks to you and you're like, don't look to me, you're the CEO. So you're obviously mentoring her and helping her find her voice. But what else is different for you as now another, it's a second time founder, but you're, let's say, a second time successful founder now with all this experience, especially with that 12-year run at GA?
I can say it's interesting because I'm sensitive, even as I'm saying this, like I had my own, what I was bringing to it, and Anna brought her own things to it, her own lessons, and it is negotiating that makes our day-to-day lives today, even today, 5 years into this new journey.
Yeah.
Is that I brought, I think, an understanding of how the game is played at every inning of it.
Mm-hmm.
And being able to see, okay, that matters, that doesn't matter. This matters way more than it seems like it does right now. This isn't great now, but it doesn't matter, so we're not even going to worry about it, right? Like what problems to fix, what problems to focus on. But it created an incredible weight of a different type of expectation, right? And a desire. I wanted this to be bigger, better, the whole thing. And I think part of this testament to you, I think Anna is like 10 times better than I ever was, and is way more capable of running a much bigger, organization than I was. And so I was like, let's go. You're going to be great. Like, we do it. Right. And she's still she was in the very beginning, like, okay, getting her orientation to it. Now it's different, now she has an incredible team and she's doing all the things that a CEO at that stage does.
Mm-hmm.
But early on, I was like, well, this is great. Let's go. Like, I smell it. We're on it. Let's not even, in some ways I was being the VC that I was complaining about in that first thing, which is sort of, I think one of the lessons of all of this is it all comes around. It is so much a function of role as much as personality.
Yeah.
And having a little humility around that, I think it's gone a long way.
Yeah.
So I think like the biggest thing is knowing, okay, when is this real? When is it not? Not being so insecure about, are we going to be able to raise money? What are people going to think? Because I think the one thing that being a second time founder, especially a successful second-time founder, is that people will write you checks pretty much just because of who you are.
Yeah.
Now, I will say, I think with the fullness, now I can look back on our first couple of rounds and our later couple of rounds. I'm not sure that having that ability in our toolkit did us any favors. Because I think more and more there is a sort of formative, like, pressure cooker of those early rounds that battle harden you.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we were a little relaxed, and we were also in the middle of one of the craziest, longest bubbles in the history of the world, and we'll never know how much was due to that. But I would say the business today is in a much more, we have been out raising right now, and that's been a successful outcome. And in our last round too, we're both sort of, as things were not quite as bubblicious. I would say we're much more battle hardened, right? As a business, as a team, as a business model, right? Than we were previously. And so maybe that's the other really piece of advice is the challenges you face are where you build your muscles.
Mm-hmm. Very powerful.
And I see people all the time who get hung up on the problems in their business and they feel bad about the problems in their business, right? Mm-hmm. And it could be anything and any challenges. But the secret is those challenges, like that is what it is to have a business. There's no such thing on any scale, at any stage of a business that just runs.
Yeah, that's so true. And it's so true. And that's where you build your muscles, to your point. I think that's great.
The practice of running a startup or being a CEO is the practice of solving problems.
Right.
And accepting that. Right. That is your job.
That's so true. That's so true. I tell all my clients, problems everywhere. Like, yep, another day. We call it Tuesday.
I could caught myself doing that during the years of GA, of like catching myself fantasizing about some moment, right, where everything's just running, humming perfectly, and everything's just, going as it should be. And, what would I even do that day? Right?
That's right.
And of course that doesn't happen. That's not ever going to happen. It's not in the construct of what you're doing.
Right. Totally. I love it. Jake, just a couple more questions here. What do you wish you had known earlier on your journey?
I'm going to give two answers. One super emotional, which is to say that everyone has a leader inside them, and your job is to figure out where that leader is and how to access it on command. The second thing is much more practical, which is that operational finance is not anything like theoretical finance. And you should take that very seriously from day one of your business. Because I've just learned that lesson over and over again. And I don't think it can be stressed enough.
I love it. So you wish you'd known that in your journey. And then what advice, summing it all up, what advice do you have for founders as they embark on their journey to grow into leaders?
Give yourself permission. Let the world tell you what too little or too much is. Don't be afraid of. Maybe it comes down to there's an old sales saying that I like, which is that if you're not being told no, you're not asking for enough. And I kind of think that applies to being a leader as well. If you're not hitting boundaries and bumping up against things, you are not fully exercising yourself in what you could be.
I love it. Jake, what a joy it has been to talk to you. I appreciate your insights so much, and also your style. It's just such a great discussion, and everyone's really going to take away a lot. So thank you.
I got to tell you, this is probably the weirdest interview I've ever done. In that, I hope it's listened. I think when you're media trained as a CEO, you literally are you would have these packaged stories, right? And you would sort of say, and I, like a stand-up comic, I would be sort of working on a bit, right? Okay, this is my thought on the future of education, and I would practice different ways of saying it, with the goal of it being like a really tight, 30-second soundbite that gets printed or gets highlighted. And so this was like the exact opposite. This felt like almost like a shrink session. And so I appreciated it. It was fun. It was therapeutic for me. So I hope it's interesting to somebody else. But if not, I had a great time. So I'm maybe
Thank you so much. Thanks for listening to From Startup to Grown Up. If you like what you heard, give it a review on Apple Podcasts so other people can find it. And if you know of a founder or someone else who is meant to be on this podcast, drop me a line through my website, alyssacohn.com.